Hello, audience, wherever you may hail. I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus. Join us as we explore some of the world's most fascinating and essential contemporary developments, shedding a spot of light in a world filled with alternative fact darkness. In this episode, we are joined by Halyna Kurylo, talking about how the Russian invasion of Ukraine is affecting the country's disabled community. Halyna is Director for Ukraine Rapid Response for Disability Rights International, or DRI. Halyna, welcome to The Focus.
Thank you, John. I am happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And just hello from morning in Ukraine.
Thank you. Hope you're keeping safe. That's the most important thing. Halyna, what made you become interested in disability rights?
Well, it's a slightly sideways story. I have two majors. I am English Ukrainian interpreter and translator. And then I did my master's in social work and social policy. And when I was a student of the social work program, I also worked as an interpreter for different international agencies. And one client of mine was Disability Rights International. So I followed them on their investigation in, I think it was 2011, 2010. On their investigation they did here, they did monitoring of human rights in institutions and disability rights. And also I joined them and translated for them during the conferences and workshops on CRPD, which is the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And it was a revelation to me because as a social work student, I was supposed to know and feel these things, and I didn't. I only, it was very eye-opening experience for me on how the system of care actually looks like in the country and what rights approach really is. And that got me hooked, basically. And when I graduated, I started working with DRI, and they trained me. Most of my education in the social policy and the rights-based approach was like on-the-job training. And I'm really, really grateful for that.
You know, Halyna, the rights of the disabled differ quite starkly around the world. Prior to the February Russian invasion of Ukraine, can you tell us how both Ukrainian policy and society took care of their disabled?
In fact, I wouldn't say the rights of people with disabilities vary. The adhering to rights of people with disabilities vary because, and it's guaranteed by the Convention of the UN that every person with disability has a right to be fully integrated into community, to be a rightful member of the community, and that communities need to do so-called reasonable adaptation so that people with disabilities do not feel the barriers they might feel. Of course, as every convention, it's a very idealistic document, and it's something we should, as every society, we should strive for. And in Ukraine, even before Russian invasion of 2014, because it did not start in February this year, it started longer ago. We had a very fragmented system of care for a person with disability. For example, well, it was fragmented between at least 3 ministries. And when the person is born with disability, they first would go through Ministry of Health, then at a certain age, Ministry of Education or Social Policy would take over, and then they will end their life in the under Ministry of Social Policy programs. And the problem we still have is that even though Ukraine is a very progressive country, we have this massive legacy from the Soviet Union of institutional care for people with disabilities. In the USSR, it was very common to deny existence of a Soviet person who is somewhat different. So every person who had either intellectual disability or psychosocial disability or combined with physical disabilities, they were put away into institutions, and mostly these institutions would be placed in the very remote locations, not even outside the cities, but outside the villages. And the most disabled were usually taken care of, like it's quote unquote in these places.
Yeah.
So we still have this, and this is something that Disability Rights International is working on and is concerned with. It's that even though the Ukraine has ratified the Convention of Rights of People with Disabilities, it still denies its rights to a certain part of the population. As of today, we have, according to statistics, we have 2.7 million of people with disabilities in Ukraine. And I think it's not the end number. I believe there are more of them. And the model of disability, we still use medical model of disabilities. I mean, the basis for all the services, when a person is equated with its disability, and that's how we are able to actually put away people into institutions. It's getting better. The situation is getting better, and but mostly in terms of physical accessibility. That's something that has been going on before the war, and I think now, when a lot of infrastructure is ruined, when it will be rebuilt already with the physical accessibility standards in mind, because it's always, it's difficult to adapt something that is already there, but when it's ruined, I mean, it's of course it's a tragedy, but at the same time we have a chance to accelerate the accessibility. However, for people with intellectual and psychosocial disabilities, there are still barriers, and this is something that that is really concerning, because when we equate a person with disability to their disability, we dehumanize them. And when we dehumanize them, it's a straight pathway to abuse, and also to abuse not only the body, but abuse of the soul, the human soul, because their full potential is not recognized. They are just labeled as without any perspective, put away into institution, and since early childhood, if you're brought up in an institution, of course, your emotional development is stunted, psychological, neurological development, not to mention the lack of movement and lack of rehabilitation within these institutions that further disables the body. So this is not all care. I mean, in Ukraine, we have different services for people with disabilities. We have disability allowance. We have so the disability is included in almost all policy making spheres, but at the same time, there's a certain percentage of people, and it's not small, that is invisible, and that falls through the grid of the system. And this is something that is my mission, my personal mission, and my organization's mission to change.
It's interesting hearing what you say, because it wasn't that long ago I saw a couple of documentaries on how the United States and the various states of the United States took care of mentally ill people. They had them in asylums. Abuse was quite rife in those asylums, so I don't think any particular country has clean hands when it comes to taking care of disabled, whether physically disabled or mentally disabled. But having said that, the thing is that I think you're right. I think that, out of the current tragedy your country's going through, there is the possibility that in the reconstruction, you'll be able to, bring in all these 21st century capacities and architecture that will allow people to move within and between buildings much easier than they did before. The question that I have for you, though, is, in Ukraine, you see, in Australia, we've got a federal system where we've got, overarching national policy, duty of care, if you will, from the federal government for disabled people. And then, of course, we've got the states, and the states will share the responsibility with the federal government in distributing care. How does care take place in Ukraine? Do you have a similar sort of structure where there are perhaps provincial authorities? Do the provincial authorities talk to the national government very well, or is there conflict? Can you explain how that works, perhaps?
This is a very interesting question. It's you're right that no country is clean with that. Even in the European Union, sometimes it depends what we consider institutions. Sometimes they are not called institutions, but they are essentially congregate care. So it's just no country is definitely has figured it out. But I think this is our like a collective way of evolving our consciousness when. The convention has the set of standards that are really high, and just going towards these towards reaching these standards is already a process of development. It will take us some time as a as a humanity. But in terms of care in Ukraine, again, as a system, as the legacy of Soviet Union, everything was really centralized. So everything that pertained to government care would be very centrally planned. And this is not a really good idea, neither in terms of economy nor in terms of social care, because it's very cumbersome. It doesn't react quickly to the needs. It doesn't know the needs on the places, on the sites. However, I think it was about 10 years ago, administrative reform of decentralization has started. And this was very encouraging in our work, because that would give way towards locally established budgets and locally controlled budgets. And then it would help us establish this mechanism, money follows the person, instead of receiving care in the governmentally funded big machines that need a lot of money to just exist, all the stuff, all the utilities, and it's just a bigger 200-bed facility is always expensive to maintain. And instead of that, money follows the person, so that a family that has a child with disabilities could choose where they receive services. And so that was really, there was a lot of hope at the beginning of this reform. And it did work in some way, but because these places were not, like the deinstitutionalization didn't fully happen, there are still places for the most disabled. And we see that if we go back to the war, we talked as a DRI, and a lot of activists talked that institutionalization is dangerous. Institutions are dangerous places for children, for adults, because it's congregate care, abuse behind the closed door, and all that. We know that. However, the current war shed light on another aspect of danger of the institutions, is that they are really slow to react, and a lot of institutions were left on the occupied territories even now, or were evacuated in the very last minute, only because there was a lack of coordination and communication with the government. So the director of the institution would wait for the direction from the central government, but then they were also dependent on the local government that was substituted by the military administration. So instead of like having an oblast administration, there was like a new person came in because of the martial law. And because of lack of the connections and communications and resources, because imagine 100 in Kherson, there is a city Oleshki in Kherson region. It's very close to Kherson, and it was almost immediately occupied. In February, we were still on the phone with the director saying, please help us, please let us help you to evacuate. Let us help you. DRI is a human rights organization. We are advocacy organization. We are not direct service provision. However, we are able to be a voice for these people, and we were able to mobilize some international rescue organizations that would go and help them. And they said, we don't have permission of local government, or not the permission, but just like a clear order. And then there was a problem, because if you are a family with a child with, let's say, very severe disability and a lot of mobility issues and seizure disorder, it's challenging to evacuate, but you are a family and you can kind of manage it with support, without support. It's could be more or less difficult, but it's possible. When you have 100 people like that, you need special transportation. A lot of them will not survive the road. You need staff. You don't have enough staff per number of people with high care needs, and then you need a place that would host you, and that would be also accessible and accessible in all kinds of ways. And this combination of factors led to a lot of institutions like that. This one that I'm talking about in Oleshki, they were in occupied territory. They found themselves in occupied territory. And for some time, we still had a connection with them, trying to, ask about how they were and their needs. And they were running out of medicine. They were scared. And then they were so scared that they didn't talk to us on the phone or write because of the fear, because their phones were checked. And then we lost track of them. And now I learned from the news a couple of days ago that 12 people from Oleshki, because right now Russian government is evacuating people from what they claim their newly added territory of Kherson. They're claiming that they're evacuating them, taking care of them, so-called, because of the preparation toward the street fights in Kherson and more higher level of hostilities. So 12 out of 100. I wonder what happened to the rest, whether they're still alive. And, we don't know that. And it's presented by the Russian government. Again, they used this particular institution for PR purposes. They came in and they took pictures showing that, hey, Ukraine is mistreating and abandoning its people with disabilities. And it's very tricky. So this is one of the dangers of the institutions, that you cannot quickly evacuate and take care of a large number of people. And also imagine a lot of vulnerable people in one place. This is the perfect target. This is a perfect human shield. Institution in Borodyanka, it's right outside of Kyiv, at the beginning of the war. They were used as a human shield, and certain people died because they didn't have access to care. It was for adults, and they were not evacuated. The Russians just used them because they knew that Ukrainians would not attack if they are hiding behind them. So it's another danger that nobody thought of before the war, even though there were cases like that in the World War II. So
I mean, it's an amazing story you tell, because frankly, there's a lot of room for, well, dare I say, war crimes to be committed, either by commission or omission, whether or not it's a case of the Russians not providing support or the Russians providing support, because quite frankly, I don't know about you, but I suspect that the Russians probably wouldn't be taking care of Ukrainian disabled all that well anyway. So the likelihood of them being injured or killed on the way to being deported somewhere else is quite high. Look, considering the difficulties involved, especially with regard to families, has there been reports that disabled children have, basically been abandoned by families because they just, logistically speaking, they just didn't know how to lift them, put them in the vehicle, and then take off with them in a safe manner? I mean, how does that all work?
Well, I personally do not know the reports, like stories actually reported like that. I have anecdotal stories and similar stories to what you're describing. There were cases of institutions being evacuated from the east, like Donetsk, Luhansk region at the beginning of the war, to the west, and part of the children stayed in institutions on the west, and part of the same place, partially they were put into institutions on the west of the country, and partially they were taken abroad.
Right.
And there was a kind of a triage system when more disabled were left behind in the institutions and less disabled were taking abroad to like countries that were willing to host them. And among those left in the institutions on the West, I met at least several children who had families, whose families placed them into institution because that was like easier for them. For example, if there are several children in the family and they have to also be internally displaced, they kind of delegated to the government the care of their child. And I met one child who was in an institution for mostly nonverbal children with a lot of mobility issues. It's like it's level 4, it's called in Ukraine level 4. We have like this stratification 1 and 2. It's a light disability, and 3 and 4. It's physical combined with mental and medical and all of that. And he maybe had slight scoliosis, maybe not even that. So he was like mentally intact, perfectly verbal, 11-year-old. And I asked him, what is he doing there? And he's like, my family couldn't. For some reason, his family thought that it would be better for him to be in an institution. And he was so bored there. He's like, I don't have anybody to play with. And he only had his phone to continue mental stimulation so that he doesn't lose his cognitive functions, because he was like very lonely there. Institutions are not places for children. And so I heard about, I heard that some of the children, but those were children who were, whose family was even before the war prone to receive services in institution rather than keep them at home. And I don't blame them, because there's there's lack of community services and lack of supports for families. They have to either be working really hard to keep their child at home, or institutionalize them, and it's like let the government take care of them. So I heard that. Also, there are cases when families, because of the disability of the child, could not evacuate or decided not to evacuate.
Right.
They made this decision sometimes at the expense of the others, of the sibling, because if they it was safer for the child with disability to stay even under the shelling than to go somewhere. And but also it's like the family is one unit, so the younger son also had to stay. And it's another story of these families. I know many of them. We interviewed them, and sometimes, most of the times, they don't have shelters, or they cannot go to shelter with the child because of the child's autism, because of the epilepsy, because the child is big and not mobile, like big meaning like in their teens, and it's difficult to carry them all the time to the basement, or there is no basement, and it's difficult to go somewhere. So that's the story. And also because of the adaptation to the child is used to one environment, and it's those who evacuated with children with disabilities stated that their children had like steps back in their development. And we all know that every little progress that the child is making in their development is very valuable, and it costs a lot of effort and also money, and the war took a lot of them like backwards in their development.
Halyna, have members of Disability Rights International been able to operate in Russian-occupied Ukraine? I mean, is there some sort of tacit agreement between Ukrainian authorities and Russian authorities, excuse me, that allows for some form of humanitarian cooperation, especially in the areas of Luhansk and Donetsk and Kherson, where, you know, the battle lines are drawn, but, you know, parts of the territories are sort of split between the two warring parties now?
No, Russians are, we cannot talk about. This war has proven that they do not respect any conventions, any laws. Like it's just they might talk about it, but they failed. So many green corridors failed. The way they treat prisoners of war. Yeah. The Red Cross that is impotent of doing anything about that. Since the beginning of the war, so many innocent people died that tried to, evacuate for that. And this was partially also because why, for example, institutions in Kharkiv region, close to Donetsk region, close to hostility line, they said, like, we are afraid to go. Like even when they were given corridors, like, we are afraid to go because they just shoot whenever they want. So no, and in terms of DRI, we have it's difficult to operate right now because of the well, we are all in different regions. We have 4 in Ukraine team, and but the main office is in Washington, and I'm myself internally displaced because my home is in Kyiv, and I have 2 young kids, and I decided not to stay in Kyiv for safety purposes. So I'm in Ukraine, but in the village, in the mountains, as far as possible from everything. But we have one of our members in Sumy region, which is like maybe 60 kilometers from Russia border, and one in Kyiv, and one is displaced to Croatia because again, she was evacuating from Irpin, and it was also not a safe place to be with children. Well, we do what we can. We travel to places that are relatively safe. I mean, there's no safe place there, but there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot we can do staying inside of Ukraine. So we are doing what we can under the circumstances.
Yeah. I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast, and we're speaking with Director for Ukraine Rapid Response for Disability Rights International, Halyna Kurylo. Halyna, can you tell us of the scale of Disability Rights International activities within Ukraine generally? You mentioned earlier that children have been sent outside of Ukraine for safety. You've mentioned some of how this had been accomplished, but is there anything else that you'd like to tell our listeners in terms of the sheer logistics of being able to pinpoint the right person and send them off to the right location? Yeah.
Oh, in fact, that was a very discoordinated movement at the first days of the war. A lot was done on the private initiatives of, so some directors of the institutions were made a decision not to leave. Some made the decision to leave and using their own resources. So there was a lot of, especially the beginning of March, there was a lot of movement of children, of organized groups of children through borders. And back then there was still not a system in place that would allow to register everybody. And a lot of them passed through Polish border to then end up in a different country. And the problem is that even though Ukraine is a highly digitalized country, we are like proud to have a lot of things done in electronic form. We now even have, anti-air missiles systems in our phones to help our army. But we did not have comprehensive disaggregated disability data before the war. And then it made it very difficult to track the movement of who went where, who came back, who split the children between 3 institutions. That's about children in government care. About children with parents, that's slightly safer because they're parents who are taking care of them. So we are, since the beginning of the war, we are trying to monitor these processes. It's extremely difficult because it's a sensitive data, and on the one hand, it's the right thing to do to not disclose this data by the organizations that have it. On the other hand, we know from our sources in international agencies and in the government that nobody knows the final number. There's like the UNICEF claimed at the beginning that they know what is happening to 70% of all the institutions with children, 70%, and so there's that leaves 30 that they are still, they say, gathering data. And because of that, it's another like big risk of trafficking and abuse. And we are so in Ukraine, generally, DRI is doing the human rights monitoring inside of the institutions, like making sure that these doors are not closed. And we are constantly advocating for deinstitutionalization, for support to families, so that they do not have to give up children to institutions. And now we are also studying the situation of families. And by doing that, we are able to be their voice in front of international organizations, because what happened after the war, it was the whole humanitarian action was really not disability inclusive at the beginning, because it happened so quickly that, I don't know, maybe the experience from other parts of the world was, again, wars and conflicts and emergencies. For some reason, it took some time for it to start working. And so we were the voice of families of children with disabilities, and we helped big humanitarian funds see them. Because, for example, those families that stayed in their original homes under shelling, who decided not to evacuate, they kind of fell through the grid of humanitarian help because they did not have the status of internally displaced. And most humanitarian funds at the beginning, they set up their offices in, relatively safe parts of the country, which is like west, southwest of the country, and they took care of those who were, moving, and those who stayed were left. They did not have a status of internally displaced with the government, so they did not get these services that the internally displaced got, and also for humanitarian organizations, they were not visible. And so we kind of took this part of the work and made sure that humanitarian funds are proactively seeking people with disabilities to help, because it's a reasonable adaptation. A person who doesn't have disability is more resilient in the war. They are not so much dependent on services or on medicine or on. Usually, only one of the parents worked in these families, and then at the beginning of the war, when most of the jobs were lost, it was a disaster, and they were invisible. So that's we are not focused on any particular region. We are trying to encompass all Ukraine as much as possible, that we can reach, sometimes by phone, sometimes by internet, sometimes just traveling there if it's safe to travel.
So Halyna, you might mention about the internally displaced people. Now, I would imagine that they are now congregated in semi-organized camps. If that's the case, what is the care provision like for disabled children within these camps? Have infrastructure been set up, or is it still very much, I don't know what you call it, a gesture of goodwill just by thinking about it, not necessarily being able to follow through on anything?
That's actually a big problem. Just yesterday at the Age and Disability Technical Working Group, we were discussing modular settlement for IDPs, and how poorly accessible they are, not only for people and children with disabilities, but also for seniors. And and we were discussing that it's expensive to set up these places, and then they are not really the best option. And maybe it would be better to start buying small apartments the government should start buying apartments in smaller cities where it's not so expensive, and placing people not in one congregate again setting, but also placing them, integrating them in the community. And it's on the one hand, when people are moved from really dangerous regions to safety, at the beginning, anything is good. Like a mattress on the floor of the school gym is good. But because the war has been going on for the last 8 months, and we predict that it will not end tomorrow, some more sustainable, more long-term solutions are needed. A lot of families with children with disabilities who moved to like west of the country later decided to go back home, even though it was not completely safe, because they did not find a suitable and comfortable place for them, or their child was a problem for the the bigger community. And the same goes for abroad. A lot of families who left the country found themselves abroad, not integrated, and also with the language barrier, especially for kids to receive services, and they decided to come back to Ukraine. It's disability is an extra challenge in this already challenging situation. And same goes for people with disabilities, for just even physical disabilities. Evacuation was a nightmare for them.
For sure. Halyna, what sort of support has DRI received from the Ukrainian government and from foreign agencies? Are you satisfied by this support if you've received it, or are there huge gaps in, the level of support that you'd be expecting for such a huge logistical challenge?
Well, DRI has not received any support. We are, like, if you mean for our activities, we are looking for enough to be integrated into some kind of program, but so far we have been going on personal donations, and it's just pure enthusiasm in most cases. But in terms of help of different agencies to Ukraine now, this is again our role too. It's I see that a lot of resources is going to Ukraine from international organizations and from people who are not indifferent to what happens to people in Ukraine from all over the world. Volunteers, different missions, different charities go inside. So a lot of resources is being poured into Ukraine, and the problem is that usually these resources go to already existing, let's say, schemes or ways of doing things. So, for example, there's a lot of help to orphanages. And because it's easy to come and help. What we are trying to say is that it's not an acute phase already, and it's not going to end tomorrow, the war. So we need to be, while helping and while mobilizing this international money, we need to be thinking about sustainability and disability inclusion, because first of all, we are going to have more people with disabilities. Like the number of people with disabilities is increasing every day because of the war, and it's going to be even more after the war ends. So we need to think about this already today, and not to wait until the end of so-called emergency and when we are going to development phase. This is the problem of international, especially humanitarian funds. They have these like a separate support for emergency phase, separate support for development phase, and they are not separated, they overlap. The development should be happening already now, because lives are at stake. And I believe that international assistance could be used more effectively, especially what concerns people with disabilities, because just setting up an physically accessible point of giving out humanitarian packages or some kind of help is not disability inclusive enough, let's say. So the more structured programs and commitments are needed. Otherwise, a lot of it's just not effective use of resources. That's all I can say.
Can you tell us something about the mental and emotional anguish faced by children having been evacuated to other countries? I'm assuming that many were separated from their parents. So it wasn't like, you know, it was a full package of parents and children who would go. You know, the parents would probably stay or be placed elsewhere, and the children would have to be moved on. How does that work? And in terms of you guys operating at the coalface, how does this affect the average DRI worker? It must be just tragedy upon tragedy, really.
Well, yes, you're right. There was a high number of what's called separated and unaccompanied children, and there was even a whole task force set up by international organizations trying to care about that. In DRI, we're like really narrowly focused on institutionalized children or at risk of institutionalization because this is an overlooked segment of the child's population.
Yeah.
Mostly the separation happened when children were taken abroad. Children who are in institutions in Ukraine, in so-called orphanages, 90% of them have parents. So they're not orphans technically. They're just placed there. So there were some institutions that evacuated so quickly that they didn't even have time to do the procedure of asking permission of the parent. And I know at least one case when a sister was looking for her half-brother who was in an institution outside of Kyiv. And then he was evacuated somewhere abroad, and nobody informed neither her nor her father where was he and how was he. And he was still technically a child, as he is 16. And it took us 3 months to find a child, and it was really, really weird because, again, the director of an institution was making all the decisions. For some reason, it took them 3 months to inform parents where the child is, and they couldn't, and even then they were not allowed to visit. It's all really, really, to me, it's really, really difficult to see how, for example, the government of Ukraine asked for the hosting countries, when they receive an organized group of children, not to separate them, so not to integrate them into the communities, just keep them in one place. And I cannot even imagine what it could be for a child who was suddenly taken somewhere in a large group, placed in a new country, and the number of staff that traveled with children is also lower than they usually are used to. Parents cannot visit them, and it's just being in an institution is already separation from your family, but at least some families visited, and then when it happened, it was like that. And another thing that really, really troubles me is that children who lose parents now because of the war, they are, most of them do not have this status of orphan, because some of the parents, we know they are dead, but there is no, either body was not found or not possible to identify, so there is no documents that a parent is dead and the child is orphan. There's a document that a parent is has disappeared, so it doesn't give the status. When they don't have a status of lost parental care, then they are not eligible for example, kinship care or foster families, and they have to be placed into an orphanage. So there are new orphanages being created now, and a child who just lost the parent now in congregate care, it's bad for their, it's even worse for their emotional and psychological health, because it's not possible to provide necessary one-on-one support and one trusted adult in the orphanage. And then we go to this second part of the story, that orphanages could be evacuated and then placed somewhere abroad, and then the family ties are severed. So it's I know it's a chaos of war, but just trying to stress that this system of congregate care for children who for some reason are not able to stay with their parents, that has been in place before the war. In the war, proved just very dangerous and ineffective, and it will have long-term consequences.
Obviously, from what you say, there will be problems for those children. What did you call them at that level 4 sort of situation where they can't communicate for whatever reason? If they are then finding themselves in a situation where they've been separated, how will the authorities then be able to ever find out or even communicate with this child what is going on? It's a very tragic situation, honestly. I'm getting depressed just talking about it. I mean, I don't know how.
There
Yeah, I
was
don't know how you guys
this
do.
moment when 12 nonverbal children were brought on the train from Donetsk region to west of the country to institution. Institution, of course, did not see children like that before, because they had level 1 and 2. So they received these 12 children. They placed them all in a former gym, like bed to bed. And at first, they all had name tags on their hands, because they are nonverbal. And then their medical records were lost on the way, and it took 2 days to find them. And when the staff started, cleaning the children after the road, because there were 2 days on the road, because from the east to the west, it's a long country in this.
Yeah, it's a big country. Yes.
And so when they all stripped them and washed them, then there was a problem of identifying who is who, because the children are not talking, and the name tags were all off. The medical records with their pictures have not arrived yet, so they did not know who has what disorder, who is who, what is happening. And it lasted for like about a week, and then the medical records arrived, and they still had troubles to identify who is who, because the pictures that were taking that were placed in their personal files were all like a couple of years old, and some children did not resemble the pictures. And it's a nightmare. But it's again, the war has exacerbated what was already there. It was there before the war. The war has not created the problem.
Can I ask a question? Look, it's a bit delicate, but I think our listeners will probably understand how this would act as a force multiplier of difficulties, or for difficulties. Now, prior to the war, I mean, even going back before Crimea was an issue, the Ukrainian government obviously, was moving down the, dare I say, neoliberal Western economic model road, where for things that aren't considered urgent, funding normally gets cut, which means that situations like disability care are understaffed. Those people who are still hanging in there are overworked. Do you think that there's a case to be said that perhaps sticking to a neoliberal economic philosophy has been a net detriment to disabled children, especially now that the war has happened? It kind of really pushed a system that was already not going particularly well, but it's really pushed it over the edge?
That's a good question. I definitely know that the budget was cut for institutions, that the budget was cut before January 2022. Even somebody told me it's either 10 or 20%, and because also the country was at least claiming they're on the way toward deinstitutionalization, which was, it's a strategy 2015-2025 that is now frozen, but it was not going particularly well anyways. So the budget was cut, you're right, for the institutions. However, it's never, because it's guaranteed, certain budget articles are guaranteed for certain institutions. They cut, mostly what they cut affected not the existence of institution, but the quality of life of children, and also started created a precedent for these institutions becoming like magnets for volunteer help. And again, it would not help the children. We have many accounts that humanitarian help, like it would strengthen even more the institutions, but not children in them. What I'm trying to say is that the needs of institutions are usually confused with needs of its residents.
Right.
And institutions are not I've seen almost like 70% of institutions in the country. It's prior to the war, and then because we were like going even in Donetsk region, in Luhansk region before 2014, and they are all surviving. They're all, regardless of the budget cut, they're always on the flow. Yeah. But the quality of life of residents was bad before the cut, is bad with volunteer help, is bad with... Now, some of the institutions are right now held by international organizations, and they're also bad. It's like, regardless whether you cut the budget or increase the budget. This is a reality of congregate care. So I believe it's just, it was still a little bit hopeful that this decentralization reform and cutting down on budgets of these centrally planned institutions would help us in deinstitutionalization, because it's local governments local administrations would understand that it's more, if there is more effective use of the money, if the money was theirs, if it was their local budget. So in a way, it was slowly going in the good direction initially, but now everything is just like upside down. And that's why I'm saying that there is a need to educate international community so that we set up sustainable solutions, not just band-aid approach, donation here, donation there, and it does not help. That's what I'm trying to say every time, in every interview, in every meeting, that after, for example, BBC story, there was a lot of calls to me asking like how they can help, and like how they can bring something to this institution or pay for extra stuff. And it's like, and I kept like saying to people that it's not going to help. Unfortunately, you're like one helping directly institution will not help. And we even had these examples. One institution that received evacuees overstretched with work staff, not enough material resources, more people, cut budget at the beginning of the year, no international support. Another institution, same number of evacuees, also same situation, with completely with international support that helped them hire 10 extra staff, like a care staff, and then a couple of professional staff, like occupational therapists and massage therapists. And the result, the same. Malnourished, depressed children, which has lack of stimulation, left in bed or in a wheelchair that is not even fit to them whole day. And some of them are tied because of the lack of stimulation, they are prone to self-harm. So it's like somebody needs to keep talking about that, and that's what DRI is doing. That there has to be another way. It's going to be, the solution is not easy. That's why it's probably not picked up by anyone, but it's the right thing to do, and it's in the long term is the only right thing to do.
Look, absolutely. Look, Halyna, thank you very much for sharing your insights on the Focus. And on behalf of our listeners and our viewers and from the team at the Focus, stay safe, you and your family. You're doing a great job. Director for Ukraine Rapid Response for Disability Rights International, Halyna Kurylo. That's it for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed the show. My thanks to our guest Halyna Kurylo and producers Neil Smart and Malcolm Hughes. Thanks also to the Ozcast Network. You can find the Focus on the Sage International website at sageinternational.com.au, hitting the Media Center drop-down menu and clicking podcasts. The Focus can also be heard on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, Audible, and iHeartRadio. So if you like what you've heard, please like and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Every subscription we get or thumbs up you give helps the algorithm bump us up the digital ladder. Until next time, I'm John Bruni, and you've been listening to Sage International's The Focus.